Let's open our Bibles tonight to the book of Genesis, chapter 16. Genesis 16. Genesis 16, begin reading with verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon me. I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. And Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thine hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. The angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way of Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence comest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. The angel of the Lord said unto her, I will magnify thy seed exceedingly, and it shall not be numbered for multitude. The angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man. How would you like to be told your kid's going to be wild before they're even born? He will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also been looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. I'm sure that most of us have probably heard something about Hagar. We've at least heard her name. We know a little bit about her. We know that she was the number 2 wife of Abram. We know that she was the mother of Ishmael. But how many of us have ever really stopped to think about the circumstances of her life? What was it like to be Hagar? What was it like to be the handmaid of Sarai? What was it like to be the second wife to a very rich, very powerful man? Did you ever stop to think about some of the choices that she made? Why did she make some of those choices? Did you ever try to put yourself in her situation and I wonder what I would have done under those circumstances? Now, let me go ahead and throw this out. I've said this many times. I don't know if I've said it to you folks, but be very careful judging someone else until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Unless we really study Hagar and understand what she was, where she was, what was expected of her, can we understand why she did some of the things that she did? Oh, I would never do that. I learned as a very young preacher and an even younger husband, never say never. Never criticize someone until you have literally been in their shoes. Until you have been in their situation, it's easy to say what I would do or what I would not do. There are several ways to approach Hagar. And as I debated back and forth which way to approach, which things to cover, which things not to cover, and tried to make sense of all of it, I'm going to try to at least highlight some parts of her life and hope and pray that we can learn some lessons from this virtually unknown. Everything we know about Hagar is right here in chapter 16, chapter 17, and, well, part of chapter 18, but mostly 16 and 17 is all we know about Hagar. And yet there's some things that I hope I learned from, and I hope I can remember them. First of all, notice her background. Again, it's hard to judge someone until you know where they came from. I was raised in the South. I was raised in a Christian home. I was in church literally from the day I was 2 weeks old, and the only time we ever missed was when I was in the hospital or I was so sick that I could not get out. At one point, I was in a body cast, and I'll have to move here. I was in a body cast from right here all the way down to the big toe on my right foot. And this was not the easy to move. This was the old hard cast. And I was in a hard cast down my waist, down the leg, down to my knee with the bar between my legs so that they could pick me up and carry me where I had to go. That influenced some of the things I think. My dad had a tremendous influence. You know, things that he did, expressions that he used. And so I was brought up in a totally different environment than even perhaps some of you. And unless you know somebody's background, well, why did she do that? It was because that's the way she was raised. That's the way she was trained. That's all she knew. She didn't know anything else. And so sometimes you have to understand where people are coming from. Why did she make that decision? Because in part by her background and the way that she was raised, what happened to her after she became a servant. First of all, her background, she was an Egyptian. That doesn't mean a whole lot to us today, but her life prior to Abram was very, very limited in the Bible. She was an Egyptian. As far as background, that's one of the very few things we know. She was probably born in Egypt. She was probably raised in Egypt. She probably lived in Egypt most of her life. And we know even from Joseph and others that were in Egypt, they were different than the Jews. They were different than Abraham. They were different from anyone else. Her family probably was there. She may perhaps have even had a job there. Maybe. It's possible that she was a handmaid even in Egypt. I say possible because we really don't know, other than she was born, she was raised somewhere, she had a mom and dad somewhere, and she was a fairly grown girl or lady by the time Abram and Sarai took her. We do know she was bought by Abraham, or Abram. He wasn't Abraham till later. We know that in Egypt, buying and selling slaves was very common. Remember, the Midianites took Joseph. What did they do? They went to Egypt. They put him on the stock, on the block to be sold. And that was common. You were bought and sold. Slavery was very common in Egypt. And so with that, it's not unreasonable to think that she very well may have been a handmaid. Whatever she was before, she now belonged to Abram. She was given to Sarai. She's referred to as Sarai's handmaid, but wives didn't buy people. Abram bought her, gave her to his wife to wait on Sarai and to take care of Sarai. Her primary responsibility was to Sarai. That brings us to the point, and I almost hesitated, but we hear so much today about slavery. Might as well dive into it, right? Throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, we read a lot about servants. And I looked up the word servant in Strong's Concordance, and the word servant simply means slave. In the New Testament, Paul used a word that meant not just a slave, but a bond slave. We were we were slaves of the worst, the lowest. We were the lowest form of people, but we were slaves. And Paul refers to that. We were slaves to sin before God saved us. Now we're servants of Jesus Christ. So throughout the Old Testament, there are many, many, many references to servants. In the New Testament, there are still many references to servants, even in the New Testament. Well, I began thinking as I was thinking about this, where did slavery or servitude begin? Now, I just covered this the other night, so I'll see how many of you were listening and how sharp your memories are. Do you remember Noah's 3 kids? Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham went into his father when his father was drunk, saw his father's nakedness, came out and told his brothers what he had seen. When Noah woke up, he cursed not his son, but he cursed his grandson by the name of Canaan. Noah said Canaan will be a servant of servants. He became the first slave of Japheth and Ham, Shem, and Japheth. He became a servant to Shem and Japheth, his uncles, and he became their servant down through all generations. But the first servant was Canaan. After that, we read of servants on a very regular basis. Under the Mosaic law, the Jews were forbidden to own a fellow Jew as a servant. They could make the Gibeonites, when they captured Gibeon, they could make other countries serve slaves. They could not make a Jew a slave. They could hire him for a few years until the year of release, but a Jew could not have a servant or slave of a fellow Jew. Even under the law of Moses, and I'm going to borrow from your Sunday school lesson, God made certain, regardless of whether you were a Jewish, hired hand or a Gentile slave, God gave very strict instructions how to treat a servant. I know during our early days of our country, when people basically threw the Bible out and they terribly mistreated servants. They beat them, they raped them, they abused them, treated them like dirt or dogs. In fact, they treated their dogs better than they did their servants in many cases. But that was man's abuse of what God had established under the law of Moses. Even the Apostle Paul gave very meticulous rules and regulations how that if you own a servant, this is how you treat them. Even in the New Testament, they were to be treated. If you were a Christian, you were to treat them with respect. You were to give them their wages at the end of the day. You were not allowed to do this. You were not. Even in the New Testament, Paul said, this is how you treat people under you. On one occasion, how many of you have read the book of Philemon? Not Philippians, Philemon. Okay, almost everybody. Do you know why Paul wrote the book of Philemon? Philemon owned a bunch of servants. One of those servants was named Onesiphorus. Onesimus. I had to write it down or I'd never pronounce it. One of Philemon's servants was Onesimus. Onesimus had stolen some things from Philemon and ran off to Rome to get away from Philemon, who was a devout Christian, dedicated, faithful man of God. Onesimus went to Rome, met up with the Apostle Paul. Paul witnessed to him. Onesimus was saved by God's grace. And Paul said, now that you're saved, you need to make things right. Paul sent him back to Philemon with the letter of Philemon, the book of Philemon, to ask mercy on Onesimus. And Paul even said, whatever he stole, I will repay. Put it on my account. But the point is, Paul understood you are Philemon's servant. And now that God has saved you, you need to do the right thing and go back to Philemon. Now, Paul does ask Philemon to please release Onesimus. He's been a great blessing to me. I really need his help. But you own him. He's your servant. I won't take him unless you approve, which Philemon did, and Onesimus went back to help the Apostle Paul. But even then, Paul was very careful to make certain in many of his books, masters, this is how you treat those under you. Well, America did away with servants in the 1800s, correct? How many of you believe that the Civil War did away with slavery? Come on, nobody? You know, there are still slaves today, only today we call them employees. If you're an employee, you work for whoever hired you. For that 8 hours a day, or 9 or 10, for that time, you belong to them. They are your boss. They are your master. And they have the right, by virtue of their position, by virtue of the fact you work for them, they pay you. You have an obligation to be the best servant you can be. Paul dealt with that in his writings. If you work for someone, you be the very best Christian example on the job that you can possibly be. Moses and Paul both gave instructions to the employer, the master. Now, we don't call them masters. Depending on your boss, there may be several things you call them. But they are your master. They tell you what to do. They have the right to tell you what to do. And your job as an employee is to do what you're told. When I was working back in the early days of Answers in Genesis, we had a general manager, and he and I clashed like oil and water. I was in charge of a certain department, and I would go to him and say, okay, this is what I need, this is what I need. And there were a couple of times that we got into a very stern disagreement. I know y'all can't picture me being disagreeable. But when he said, do it, he's a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army. When he said, do it, I would salute, yes, sir. At that point, discussion was done. At that point, it didn't matter what I thought. At that point, my only job was to carry out his order. Now, when we were discussing, I would be very heated in discussing, given my point of view. But once he said, that's it, do it. Literally, I would stand there, if I can stop hitting that. Yes, sir, Colonel. And I would turn around and do, whether I liked it or not, whether I agreed with it or not. He was the general manager. I was simply a manager. My job was to carry out his wishes. I discussed it. I made certain I got my point in, and he would discuss it with me. But there came a point when he said enough. My job as an employee was to do the instructions of the general manager. Notice Hagar is Abram's wife. She became Abram's second wife. Their relationship and her conception is not called adultery in the Bible, because in verse 3, it literally says, Abram hearkened unto the voice of his wife. Abram had dwelt 10 years, and Abram, she gave her, Sarai gave Hagar to her husband Abram to be his wife. She was his wife at that point. Now, as his wife, she continued to be the handmaid of Sarai. She still, she still had a job. She still had to work. She still had to care for Sarai. But now she is also the wife of Abram. And that brings up the question, what about polygamy? I was talking to a guy years ago, and he said, why would you want more than one? I can't handle the one I've got. And I thought, yeah, I know your wife. I don't think anybody can handle her. I've heard people say that, hey, if you got a dozen wives, if one gets in a bad mood, you just go to the next one. If she's in a bad mood, you just go to the next one till you find one that's in a good mood. But it does bring up questions. Why did God permit polygamy? The first biblical instance of polygamy is found in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 19, when Lamech took unto him 2 wives. They're both called wives. The name of the one was Adar, and the name of the other was Zillah. This is just a few years after the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden. It's just a couple of generations down. In the Old Testament, Abram had 2 wives, Jacob had 4, David had many, and then the crown of them all was Solomon, had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which were a sort of second-class wife. Why did God permit that? Or did God approve of it? David had many wives. He's called a man after God's own heart. Abram had 2 wives before Sarah died. Then he married a 3rd wife after Sarai died. And he's called the friend of God. So, according to some people's logic, that means God must have approved of multiple wives. Now, I'll clarify that in a second. In the New Testament, Jesus made it very clear. Paul made it very clear. When it came to the office of a bishop, it is ironclad, nailed down, unmovable, unchangeable. In the New Testament, it's God made Adam and Eve, brought them together and said, for this shall a man leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his own wife. Singular. In the case of divorce, in Mark chapter 10, and if you will, turn over to Mark chapter 10, because I'm going to be using several verses here. Mark chapter 10, I want to show you, did God approve of polygamy? And I think Jesus answered that right here in Mark chapter 10, beginning with verse 1. I'm not going to read every word. I'm going to kind of skim down. But it said, he arose from thence, went to the coast of Judea, and the people resorted unto him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The Pharisees in verse 2 asked him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? Now they were trying to cross him up. They were trying to get him to say something that they could use against him. So the question was very specific. Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? He answered and said unto them, what did Moses, notice the answer is even more specific than the question. What did Moses command you? Well, they immediately began justifying. Well, Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. Notice their answer. Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement. Jesus nailed it down in verse 5. Because for the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. Moses wrote this precept because of the hardness, the stubbornness, the rebellion of your heart. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them lesbian, gay, transgender, he, she, it, they. I can't even pronounce all the words they called themselves. By the way, I'm not a beer drinker. Budweiser, or Bud Light rather, is paying I think the last I heard was several weeks ago, somewhere around $20 billion loss because of their, not just their approval, they're promoting it, putting it on their cans. Target is lost, the last I read was around 10 or 12 billion dollars because they went against what God said. In the beginning, God created them male and female, period. No other genders, male and female. For this cause, because there's only male and female, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Now, I don't have time to get into it, but mothers-in-law have been the cause of many divorces. When a man, and it said the man because the man is now to become the head of his family. And he can't be the head of his family if he's still under the headship of his father and mother. I'll get on that some other day, maybe. He shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they twain, those two, shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Why did God permit divorce? And I make a big distinction. Write this down. There is a world of difference between decreeing, commanding, and permitting. God permitted divorce because of their stubborn, rebellious hardness of heart. But that's not the way God created it. Why did God allow so many wives? Because of sin. In the case of Abram, it's very clear. Sarai said, I'm not having children. Take my handmaid. She had no right to do that. She had no authority to do that. God had said, one man, one woman. Sarai decided she was going to change God's ordained way. Well, what about Jacob? And I was going through some notes, yes, it was last year, and I found a lesson that I taught 6, 7, 8 years ago on, oops, I married the wrong woman. Anybody remember that besides me? Jacob married the wrong woman. He agreed, he bargained, he bought Sarah as his wife, and Rachel as his wife, and his father-in-law switched them on the honeymoon, and instead of Rachel, he ended up with Leah. So he said, okay, I'm still going to marry Rachel, which was sin. God said, male, female, those two become one. So even though he was in love with Rachel, he had proposed to Rachel, he worked 7 years for Rachel, he married Leah, and that should have been the end of it. God permitted it because of sin. It was sin for Jacob to marry Leah and then to take Rachel's handmaid and then to take Leah's handmaid. It was sin because from the beginning, God said, one man, one woman for life. What about David? What about Solomon? The Bible's very clear. Solomon, in his older years, his wives turned his heart away from God. God permitted it. Does God ever permit you to sin? Does any of us ever go a day and sin? Nobody's going to admit it. I got you. Well, I'll raise my hand. I sin every day. Every day. Almost every hour. Sometimes every minute. Does God command me to sin? Does God make me sin? No, He permits it with the understanding that there is a price to be paid for sin. He permits it, but it's not His ordained purpose. His ordained purpose is be ye holy, even as your Father in heaven is holy. That's what God wants of us. That's what God requires of us. But He permits us to sin even though it's against His word and against His decreed will. In the New Testament, God nailed it down. You want to be a deacon? Want to be a pastor? Want to be a church leader? You cannot have multiple wives and be a pastor. I've been married over 51 years. And I can honestly say, I have never been sexually with anyone except my wife because we made a commitment before God. One boy, I wasn't a man yet, one boy and one girl for life, and we have been together 51 years. That's the way God ordained it. That's the way it's supposed to be. God permits it otherwise, but it's by His permission. Very quickly, and I'm going to have to hurry real quick. When Hagar conceives, she began to look down her nose at Sarai, her mistress. It became so bad. She looked down her nose because I got your husband and I'm having a child and you can't. I don't know if those are the words, but the attitude was there that it said she despised her mistress, her Sarai. Sarai, in return, began to totally, terribly mistreat Hagar. Hagar didn't like being mistreated, especially as a wife of Abram. So she literally packs up her bags, takes her marbles, and goes home. If you're going to mistreat me, I'll just take my marbles and go home. And so she ran away. In our text, the angel of God found her, and I'm paraphrasing, Hagar, what are you doing out here in the wilderness? Well, I didn't like the way Sarai treated me. And I read this and I tried to emphasize it. You go back. You're still a servant. Sarai mistreated you, but you are still her servant. You go back and submit yourselves to Sarai as your master. If I don't like that word, but for right now, I'll use it. It was true that Sarai mistreated her. She treated her harshly. And poor Hagar, who likes to be mistreated, who likes to be abused, who likes to be treated like dirt. That was one of the big problems with slavery in America. They left the Word of God. They left the commands of God. They did not treat their servants as human beings. They treated them like trash. And by the way, I am 1,000% against the way that they were treated. But servanthood, every one of you that work are servants to your boss. If you're retired, and right now you're the only ones here retired. Oh yeah, well you're retired, but you don't fit my illustration. Sorry about that. If you're retired, you're still a servant to your wife. I say that with some humor. God said, listen, I understand Sarai is not being much of a Christian here, but you're still a servant. You go back. Paul said, Philemon, or Onesimus, you ran away. God saved you. You got to go back and make things right. There's no option. Now, I have not always been a pastor, and even when I was a pastor, there were times that I still had to work. So I worked in public work for several years. In Tennessee, Brother Garner Smith introduced me as his assistant pastor. So I was there with the church promoting printing, but I worked Monday through Friday. I worked through a temp agency, and so I could be here today, I could be here a week, I could be over there tomorrow. I never knew until that morning where I was going to be sent to work that day. I remember the agency called me and said, "We have a job that's probably going to last you for 2 or 3 months." It's right there very close to where my mom and dad lived. And so I said, sure. Went in, signed in. They gave me the papers and everything. They took me back. I was in a little bitty office, not a whole lot bigger than our sound room. That gives you any idea. It was a little bit bigger, but not much. There were 3 ladies and then a 4th lady supervisor. She was my boss. I was the only man cramped up in that little bitty room. And the first day, the first hour, the supervisor made it very clear. She told me with every 4-letter word you could think of, "I hate men, period. I hate men. I hate that they put a man in my department. I don't like you. I will never like you. And I'm going to make your life here as miserable as I can make it." And she did. I was called every word you could think of, some I had never heard of. I got chewed out, cussed out every time. Part of my job was to write things and then put them in the computer. And you know, when you're trying to, I laid my pen down to type. I got chewed out, cussed out for laying my pencil down. I should have learned to type holding a pencil. I got cussed out, chewed out. I lasted, 3, 4 days, honey? 3 or 4 days. I went to HR and I said, "I quit." "Why? I've watched you. You're a hard worker." I ain't putting up with being called, and I had to tell her some of the things I was called. I said, "You don't pay me enough to be called every 4-letter word in the book and a few 5-letter words and then some words I don't know." I said, "You don't pay me enough. I'm a Baptist preacher. I don't have to put up with that. I'm out of here." She said, "Well, how about I put you in a different department? I'll put you in shipping." I said, "Shipping is right outside her door. I'm still going to see her every time she brings a load of things out to ship. I'm still going to have to deal with her." That is the only job in all of my entire life that I quit because I just could not stand. "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. You're a blankety, 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 blank, blank, blank. I hate you." Every other job, I've had jobs that were hard. I've had jobs that I didn't particularly care for my supervisor. But I was hired to work. And yes, I got put in some dirty, filthy jobs. But I did them because that's what I was hired for. I know people personally that they go to work. One man I know, in a year's time, he had about 6 or 8 different jobs because he didn't like his manager in any of them. And he would go in, didn't like his manager, he would up and quit and go somewhere else. God made it very clear that if you're an employee and you agreed to work, that you are required to work. You don't like it sometimes. I remember one job. My wife said, "Look at the clock." All right, I looked. It was a factory job. They had a job in that factory that nobody wanted to do. It was one of the worst jobs you could imagine. I was in a furnace room. My job was to take all the mistakes, throw them into the fire, melt them down, and be reused. It was about 5,000 degrees in that room. As you threw the materials in, smoke, dust, I would come out black as could be. But that was my job. I think I lasted longer than anyone had ever lasted. That was my job. Hagar ran. God had to send her back. She became the mother of Ishmael. If you know anything about Ishmael, he became the father of the eastern nations that are still in existence today. He became the forefather of the Arabs. There was war between Ishmael and Isaac. There is still war today between the Arabs and the Jews. It all started because Sarai decided, I don't have to follow God's word. And by Sarai's sin, and Abraham went along with it, for all of these thousands of years, Ishmael has been warring with Isaac right up until today. The Ishmaelites are still warring with the descendants of Isaac because of sin. It's one more reason. Be careful. Your sin may affect a whole lot longer and farther than you think. Father, we come tonight